right. Hey, everybody, thanks for being with us. We're in chapter 12, starting chapter 12 today. I believe the longest parable in the Gospel of Mark, and one of two that have really any length at all. The first one we saw way back early in the Gospel, the parable of the sower. Now we have the longest parable, and in some ways the most pointed. And so remember the context here. Jesus is in Jerusalem. There's growing conflict with the religious leaders. He has cleansed the temple. He's cursed the fig tree. They have questioned his authority, and he kind of slipped the noose or outsmarted them. And now Jesus tells a very convicting parable. So, verse 1, chapter 12. Then Jesus began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for a wine press, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants, and he went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. They seized him. They beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But the tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come and let us kill him, and then the inheritance will be ours." So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Let's stop there, Michael, with the story portion. So one of the challenges of parables is that they often afford us to go many different directions with them. And that's okay as long as you understand the general rule of a parable is that it's intended to tell you one thing. A parable should almost always be understood to have one primary point. And once you understand that point, it's okay then to look for inferences about the rest of the story. But there is a danger in trying to make a parable say too many things. And so in this parable, for instance, you could ask lots of questions about why a master would keep sending people, why the tenants would act like this, why they think they'll get the inheritance if they kill his son, etc. But you have to understand the point here is that the people who have been given an opportunity continue to do wrong, and no matter what the owner does, they rebel more and more and more. And you know, Michael, at this point in the story, I don't think you do not have to be a Bible scholar at any level to figure out who's who here in this story.
No, you don't. And we probably miss some of the force of it again, Clint, because we aren't quite as steeped in the Old Testament prophetic narratives as the people who would have heard this story would have originally been. And I think we also might miss, here I meant particularly the Pharisees, Sadducees, the people who are the religious leaders of that day. They're daily making reference to the prophets, to these Old Testament texts about the time when God's going to restore things, make things new. Here we have what is an unmistakable example of Jesus claiming these people who lie in the history of Israel, who tried to point the people in the right direction, and who the people abused in lots of different ways. What you also have to factor is the people who would have been handed this letter, thinking probably not Jewish people, probably Christians, maybe in Rome. And for them, this is a searing rebuke of the Jewish leadership, of the people who were supposed to be the caretakers of this covenant. I mean, this is just on its surface, just an absolute sort of knockdown argument against those who should be the ones triumphantly welcoming Jesus to the holy city, are going to be the very ones who are trying to steal the inheritance. And that's not a positive thing in any culture. And this does not leave the religious leadership with any shred of dignity.
Yeah, and as we move through the parable, the hierarchy here is servant, 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 and finally son. And again, the idea here is very, it's pretty transparent that Jesus stands on the verge of being killed by the tenants, those who have taken responsibility or who have been given responsibility for the religious life, the spiritual life of Israel, of the Jewish people, and they have abused it. And they have abused those who have tried to call them to order. They have abused those who have said, you're not sharing, you're not giving your share, you're not giving the produce of this faith to God as you are to do rightly. And instead, they are keeping it. They have stolen it and used it for their own ends. And now the Son comes. And this is, Mark foreshadowing, Jesus foreshadowing. They say instead, let us kill him, and then the inheritance will be ours. And verse 8, they seized him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. Mark is giving us a glimpse of what's coming up. And this is not, I can't imagine this is anybody's favorite parable. It's a harsh parable. It's a strange parable. It's somewhat rough. It is also, I think, probably one of the most easily understood parable. There's not a lot of interpretation that you'd have to do to get the main point of this story.
Yeah, and it is also divisive. That's not the right word. I'm not saying that Jesus is trying to cause conflict, though this story will incite conflict. There's really no way that you're going to be able to make your way through this story without those who were at the crosshairs of it being offended. And the idea that the Son is killed, it's not altogether clear that the disciples understand what that means. That Jesus is again pointing to the life that he's willing to give on their behalf. And yet here we see it as those who know what is to come. We can already see that Jesus has built that into this story, and he's already holding that crime against these leaders who feel threatened. And once again, I do think that you're right in saying, Clint, that this is probably no one's favorite parable, though in the Gospel of Mark, stories like this are not chosen haphazardly. We know that Mark is known for an economy of words, of being careful about how these things are pieced together. And, I think to give the writer credit, when you get done with the Gospel of Mark, there's no sense in which you think they might have gotten it right, that they were this close, and that if maybe Jesus had tried a little bit harder, or if they had seen one more miracle, maybe the religious leaders would have come to the other side. Mark makes it clear, it's an open shut case at the end of this gospel when it comes time for Jesus to give his life, that there was going to be no other road, that there was going to be no political sort of compromise, there was going to be no religious teaching where they all agreed to disagree. At the end of the day, it was God sending his Son, and the tenants, the evil tenants, taking the Son's life that they might get the inheritance. Those are hard words, Clint, but they're carefully chosen and purposeful words. And, I think it helps us understand where this story is going.
And two things should probably be noted. The 12th chapter of Mark is a focus on this conflict, this growing conflict between Jesus and religious people. Mark's going to put a lot of those kind of stories and that kind of theme in this 12th chapter. The other thing, I'm just flipping through here, Mike, I'm pretty sure this is accurate. I believe this is the last parable that we see. There are some lessons later that could be considered parabolic, but I think this is the last true parable we see in the gospel. And this one is interesting in that it doesn't seem to be Jesus doesn't seem to have told it for general education. In other words, it seems to be targeted. In fact, in a moment we'll see that the Pharisees realize he had spoken it against them. It is the only parable I think I can think of where it is sort of pointed directly at the people who are hearing it. There are other times Jesus tells a parable warning the listeners about somebody, generally the religious people. But in this case, I don't know of another instance off the top of my head where Jesus tells them the story that's also targeting them. And I think that's interesting. And having looked at the point of the parable, one thing I do think is worth thinking about from another perspective. And again, you have to be careful doing this with parables, so realize that I'm 2 steps away from the main point here. But when you think about the landowner here, who at his own expense plants and creates this place, turns it over to the tenants, and really it seems in the context of the story, asks only for a share of the produce, wants to share in the fruit bearing, wants to take some role in sharing what is created through his work with the tenants and his relationship with the tenants, and yet servant after servant. You know, this is almost along the order of the ridiculous, that he sent one and another one and another one, and then they killed one, and he sent another one who got beaten, and then another one who got killed, and over again until he finally gets to the point where he says, well, I only have my son left, but now they'll listen. That's almost a laughable portrait of a landowner. But when you understand what it says about God and the patience and the drive and the tenacity of God, who prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet sent people with messages of hope, with messages of rebuke, with messages of opportunity, and who finally says, none of that has worked. I will send my son. And with that in mind, if you can remove that story from the kind of ridiculousness of it and make it theological and understand what it might be capturing for us about the long-standing patience and the unwillingness to give up on the tenants that God shows in the story, it's remarkable and profound, I think.
Very much so. And it's also, as hard as it is to read this parable, it's also good news. If you come to the end of verse 9, he will come and destroy the tenants. That's the challenging part of this text. But keep going and give the vineyard to others. And once again, I think I would point us to the most likely Gentile recipients of this letter. The idea that God has made a place for you, even if you've not been part of the commonwealth, even if you had not received these prophets, and that you didn't call yourself one of the covenant, that you had a place, that this landowner was going to welcome new tenants to this vineyard, would be good news to those Christians. And so while it is challenging, and I think right to note the challengingness, there is also, I think, intended to be good news for those who will receive the grace of this landowner.
Yeah, and so let's finish up here, verse 10. Jesus says, have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and this was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. And when they realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. And again, we told you that Mark would do this. He's going to build the tension step by step as we move toward Jesus' arrests and punishment and crucifixion. And, you know, here's another step in that journey.
Yeah, and it's explicit. Not only does he quote the Old Testament in making this point, but it says explicitly that they realized he had told the parable against them. There is really no ambiguity in this parable, which I think, Clint, to your point, you made the point that This parable is told against these individuals specifically, and that is unto itself uncommon. I think it's also uncommon, maybe for most of the parables, to have this sharply pointed sort of razor thin edge point. I mean, a lot of the parables are flexible, and you can see differing aspects in the interpretation. But here it's pretty clear. Jesus has said that these are the individuals who are going to kill him, and the only reason that they are held from that is their fear of the crowd, their fear of the repercussions of the actions that they have. So the motive of these individuals has been laid bare. Jesus's ability to foresee it and to even set his will through it has been noted. And so once again, this is it's a challenging text, but I think this is a very necessary text in the Gospel of Mark to lead us towards the sacrifice that Jesus is already prepared to make.
Yeah, so that's today's text. Hope there's something in it for you. Hope that there's something challenging, inspiring, whatever that might be. It's I think this, as we journey this week, we will cover some really interesting texts in the first part of the week, focusing specifically on Jesus' growing rift with Pharisees and Sadducees, and then toward the rest of the week, there'll be some passages that I think are pretty good as well. So I hope you'll be able to join us. Thanks for being here today, and we will see you again.
See you tomorrow, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.